free. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Mediation and Beyond's YouTube channel. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Amy J.L. Baker, who has a Ph.D. in developmental psych from Teachers College of Columbia University. She's the author and co-author of 9 books and over 100 academic articles. She is a nationally renowned expert in parental alienation and children of divorce, and has trained legal and mental health professionals around the country. She's also provides telephone coaching for parents dealing with alienation. And you can find Dr. Baker at amyjlbaker.com, and I will post that information in the details. So good morning, Dr. Baker. Thank you so much for coming on.
Good morning, my pleasure.
So as I spoke to you, what I'd really like to kind of focus on today is during the pandemic, you know, divorce, or people who are thinking about divorce or are separated, has been more challenging than usual. But what I wanted to focus on today, because I hear this and I see this in a lot of groups online and stuff, is how to identify alienation and kind of exactly what is it, instead of people just kind of slinging the word around and not having accurate information, or wanting to run to court, which you can't really do anymore right now. It's harder with kind of just running to court for fear of something that maybe isn't happening. So how does one go about, like, well, one, what is parental alienation, and how do you go about identifying that?
So it's a great place to start. The term does unfortunately mean different things to different people. So when I speak, I'm going to be talking, you know, as an expert in the consensus understanding that the rest of us experts have developed. So the shorthand is that it's a parental alienation is a family dynamic in which one parent engages in behaviors that foster the child's unjustified rejection of the other parent. So, of course, any parent whose child is rejecting them will find this to be an appealing explanation. It's not me, my kids are rejecting me because of the behavior of the other parent. So it does happen that a lot of people think it's going on, and it actually may or may not be happening. And there is a way, thankfully, there is a way to know if it's alienation or something else. And so there's sort of a myth out there of, oh, it's impossible to tell. It's he said, she said, who knows what the truth is? Oh, it's probably both parents' fault. There's a lot of assumptions that people bring to this family dynamic or this situation. And some of those assumptions are right, but some are wrong. So 2 that are incorrect are that it's impossible to tell if it's alienation, and that anytime a child rejects a parent, it's probably both parents' fault. So those are faulty assumptions. So the way you can tell if a child who is rejecting a parent is alienated from that parent or estranged from that parent, and the term estranged refers to justified rejection, whereas alienation is unjustified rejection. Okay. So the way that you can tell is through the 5-factor model. All 5 factors have to be present to say that a child who's rejecting a parent is an alienated child opposed to an estranged child. So the first factor is there has to be some element of contact or relationship refusal. In other words, that's sort of the triggering event. If everything is peachy keen, nobody would be saying what's going on is it alienation. Right. Then there's 4 things that have to be present to say that, yes, this child who is resisting, rejecting a relationship is alienated. The first is there has to have been a prior positive relationship between the child and the parent whom the child is now rejecting. So you can't have a parent come in and say, I abandoned my kids 11 years ago, I've had nothing to do with them, and now I'm back and I want to see them, but they don't want to see me. It must be alienation. No, it doesn't meet that threshold of factor 1. Factor 2 is absence of abuse or neglect or seriously deficient parenting. I want to pause for a moment and say a couple things about this. The first is we're not talking about allegations. We're talking about founded abuse or neglect. right? Because anybody can say, oh, he abused, she's abusive, and that may or may not be true, but that shouldn't rule in or rule out alienation. We want to see from Child Protection Services that abuse has actually been verified. If it has been verified, it's not alienation.
Okay.
So that's the first point. The second point is most abused kids don't actually reject their abusive parent. So it's fairly rare. But if they did, we would not call that alienation. All right. And so that's what factor 2 is. Absence of abuse or neglect on the part of the parent who the child is now resisting, rejecting. Factor 4 is evidence that the favored parent is engaging in many, doesn't have to be all, but many of the 17 primary parental alienation strategies. These are behaviors that research has demonstrated 2 things about them. 1, they're bad for kids, and 2, they can cause a child to unjustifiably reject the other parent. So if we see a child who's rejecting a parent, we don't want to assume that the favored parent is behind the scenes making it happen. We need to independently assess for that. And we need to see, there's no hard and fast number. It's not like it has to be 10 out of 17, but we need to see multiple ongoing parental alienation strategies on the part of the favored parent. And then factor 5 is that the child is exhibiting multiple, usually it's 7 or 8, of the 8 behavioral manifestations of alienated kids. These are 8 behaviors that are unique and specific. Even kids who have been abused don't exhibit these behaviors towards their abusive caregiver. So if you have all 5 factors present, yes, there's a problem in the relationship. There was a good enough relationship at some point.
Right.
The rejected parent didn't do anything terribly egregious. We independently are finding that the favored parent is engaging in many of the 17 primary parental alienation strategies, and lo and behold, the child's exhibiting the very specific behaviors that only alienated kids exhibit. Then you can say it's alienation.
Wow. So it is, so you can substantiate that because you've broken it down to the guidelines around it.
It's a sort of a template or a framework. And then for a targeted parent, if what they want to do is make the case that it is in fact alienation, whether it's to a custody evaluator, to their own attorney, and then ultimately perhaps to the court, that's how they should structure their evidence. And that should really be the template for the direct exam that their attorney walks them through. Can you establish for the court that there was a prior positive relationship? Can you establish that there was no abuse or neglect? Can you establish that the other parents doing the very things we know cause children to unjustified, on and on. You walk them through those 5 factors.
And so once you walk people through that and someone can say, listen, everything was fine and now it's not, right? What are some things like signs that we would notice from a parent, from the favored parent, that they're doing to alienate?
Well, it's just, those are the 17 primary parental alienation strategies. I think that honestly, all divorcing parents or parents who were in a relationship and had a kid together and aren't in a relationship anymore should be familiar with those 17 behaviors, either to stop themselves from doing it or to recognize when the other parent is doing it. To me, the saddest thing is a parent who calls me and says, now that I see those 17 behaviors, I can connect the dots and see that that's what the other person was doing, but I didn't have a framework. I just thought, oh, they're kind of doing this bad thing, and they're sort of doing that. That doesn't seem helpful. But I didn't realize all of those things worked together to rupture the attachment between me and my child. So getting familiar with those behaviors is really the number one thing the parent should be doing.
Where would someone find that list of 17 behaviors?
Well, they're sort of all over the internet at this point. I mean, they're based on my research, and they're certainly in some of my books. Trying to think. So there's a book called The High Conflict Custody Battle that is for parents to teach them how to organize their documents, how to find the right attorney, do they need a parental alienation expert, how to prepare for a custody evaluation. It certainly is in there. All the factors and how to organize your documents to make the case that those factors are present, that would be the best book, I think.
Do the courts acknowledge parental alienation?
You know, there's no such thing as the courts. That's my experience. There's judge and judge and judge and judge. You know, there is case law that people can draw on, but that's only for appellate decisions, right? And most of the family court cases don't ever make it to the appellate decision. At least that's my understanding. I'm not a legal scholar. So, you know, I used to testify, I don't anymore, but I had the experience of being in the same courthouse. One case was on one side of the room, you know, one side of a wall in one judge's room, and the next case was in literally on the other side of the wall, same court building, different judge, different outcome, different perspective on alienation, not just different outcome because the facts were different, but one judge is, of course, alienation exists. I recognize the pattern. Let's do something about it. And the other was not convinced that alienation is even real. So I don't think there's a do the courts recognize it. It's how can we help clients make the best case possible to the judge who will be hearing their case.
And is there training for our legal professionals, such as judges or attorneys or family service workers about parental alienation?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty hit or miss. You know, there's an organization called the Parental Alienation Study Group, and there's hundreds of members, thousands probably all around the world. And we had a conference in Philadelphia like a year ago, and we brought in judges and attorneys and parents and mental health professionals, and we had different tracks. We had one track for, you know, people doing therapy and one track for the attorneys. And so there is some training, there's some good books out there, but is there enough? Absolutely not. You know, we definitely could be doing way more to educate the decision makers and the gatekeepers, you know, the mediators and the GALs and the attorneys for the minor child to really have a shared understanding.
Now, if someone who has been trying to alienate their child or children from another parent, is that classified as a mental health issue or is not really?
No, I mean, I think, you know, the clinical wisdom at this point is that many alienating parents have personality disorders, and there's some data to support that, but we don't know if everybody who has a personality disorder is going to be an alienator or whether all alienators have personality disorders. So the thing about the 5-factor model is it doesn't presume and is not necessary to establish any kind of motivation for the person doing it, or even awareness. It's just their behaviors. You know, are they interfering in communication? Are they having the child keep secrets from the other parent? Are they referring to the parent by his or her first name? From my point of view, it doesn't really matter why they're doing it. That's relevant for treatment. That's relevant for intervention. But for diagnosis, what's relevant is the behaviors, or I should say assessment. In terms of assessing a family, what you really want to know is, are these behaviors occurring?
And if someone is going through that and they've realized or taken ownership that their child is being alienated from the other parent, like if everyone's in agreement what's actually going on, or the
never happens. That has never happened. I've never had the experience. And I've had, you know, thousands and thousands of clients and cases. Okay. I think because by the time, if that happened, it would just resolve itself pretty quickly and those people wouldn't come to me. In other words, you could see a parent saying, gee, my ex-spouse, I realized I've been, you know, competing with you and undermining you, and I'm really sorry. I mean, perhaps that happens, but those aren't the cases that become moderate to severe or severe alienation.
So it really is, it has to be kind of told that they are alienating that you have alienating behaviors and now this is the outcome. And so what are, on the outcome trajectory, what are some options for connecting people, child and parent again, or children and parent again, or reunification, I guess you would call it?
So it's an interesting question, because right now the field, it's sort of like the Wild West. Pretty much anybody can say that they do reunification therapy. There's no certification. There's not that much research on what's actually happening, what they're doing, their success rates. I just completed a study. I think it's been accepted for publication, so I can talk about the data. I had to pause for a moment.
Yep.
So we surveyed 120 licensed mental health professionals who advertised on their website that they offer reunification therapy for families affected by divorce, because there's also reunification therapy for kids in the foster care system. And I wanted to just focus on this subset. So these are people who took ownership of, this is me, this is my field, I have some knowledge or expertise to offer, this is a service I provide. And we surveyed them, and we had I think 80% response rate, which is a nice high number. And what we found is pretty sad. Most people admit that they have a very low success rate. Many people don't even have joint sessions with their clients. In other words, they never bring the parent and kid together. Many people let this go on for months and months and months with absolutely, no goals, no treatment plan. They're not even conceptualizing success as repairing the relationship. And most of them do not refer the cases to a more appropriate treatment. So they can say, yeah, I have a low success rate, but I'm not comfortable saying that this case is sort of beyond me. In other words, I basically think of outpatient, or what we call in the office reunification therapy, as sort of a Band-Aid on a heart attack. And it's like, okay, if you want to try the Band-Aid, fine. But if it's not working, you need to, step it up and refer out to a more appropriate treatment. And most of them don't do that.
And what would be a more appropriate treatment if in the office isn't really beneficial to anybody, or they're not even bringing the parties together? So are there places, like you have an inpatient treatment program for people of when they're alcoholic or substance abuse? Is there anything that's...
Yeah, there are 2 programs. There should be one in every state. And right now there's basically 2 in the United States that I refer to. There's a couple more that I just am not comfortable referring cases to, but there's a program called Turning Points for Families, which is in New York. And then there's Family Bridges, which they basically travel around, they'll come to you. The problem is they're hard to get into, in that you have to have a court order. And it's hard to get the judges to accept these cases. To refer these cases to that kind of program. The other side puts up a big fuss about, this is draconian. It's so upsetting for the kids to be forced into a 4-day program with the parent, and you can't cut them off from their beloved parent who they're with. And so, the other side's going to do everything they can to make judges feel worried that referring to either of those 2 programs is risky. And in my experience, judges are highly risk averse.
Yes.
Highly, highly. In fact, when I train judges, if I'm feeling sort of comfortable or gutsy, I'll look out at the audience and I'll say, you guys, you're lazy cowards. And you know what? They don't even get offended because they know it. They're like, yeah, you caught me. It's true. They're very wedded to the status quo, whatever it is. It doesn't mean you can't get into those programs. People have navigated, they have found their way to those programs, and they're successful, but it's a hard sell for the judge, for some judges.
From the time you kind of identify that your child is being alienated from you to the time you can get into, say, a turning point, it seems like that's a long road.
And it's expensive. Yeah. And if your kid is already 16, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not discouraging anybody, but the older the kid gets,
Yeah.
the more hesitant the judge gets to do anything. It's like, oh, it's, of course, no judge would ever say, oh, little Sally's being molested by dad. No big deal. We can just, is she 16? She'll be out of that home in 2 years. But even though alienation is a form of emotional abuse, and emotional abuse can be actually worse than physical or sexual abuse, the judges don't know that. It looks like the kid is doing okay, and they're inclined to just leave things alone.
Which is highly disappointing. So this has always been one of my questions, and I know you're not a legal scholar, but just from your opinion, why is it when you see a high conflict case in the court system, isn't that elevated, or a parent hasn't seen their child and it's obviously clearly written and the parent has not been in touch with or seen that child even though there's a court order? Why isn't that like on speed dial, right? Why isn't that like just moving its way through the system really quick?
I think the issue, and there might be some states that fast track, but I think the problem is that there's two competing narratives. So from the rejected parent's point of view, it's, hey, I was a good enough parent. I put in my time. I had an attachment relationship with my kid. Sure, I was imperfect in this way or that way, but we were bonded. I didn't do anything egregious. Then the other parent started doing blah, blah, blah. And now my kid says he hates me. So that's the narrative of the rejected parent. I was good enough. I don't deserve this. My kid's being manipulated to reject me. The favored parent has a compelling, plausible alternative narrative. That person really wasn't a particularly good parent, or they were, but then they changed, and they, maybe it's not abuse, but they yell and they don't trust the child, and they're to this and to that. And little Johnny says he's afraid, and he's plucking out his eyelashes every time he thinks he has to go to dad's, and he has a tummy ache, and his grades aren't doing well. So they have a plausible narrative because the targeted parent is not perfect. They're human beings. They're either to this or to that. They're too neat or too sloppy. They are a little too late or too early, or they care too much about homework or not enough, whatever. And so you have two people on one side of the equation, the favored parent and the kid, being sympathetic. Kids are very compelling. People think you have to always believe a child, and the child seems to believe what they're saying. So it's not as simple as, oh, there's no contact, we need to, rectify this. I mean, I wish it were, but everything grinds, grinds down even without COVID, because then there has to be a custody evaluation to try to understand, why is this child, resisting contact? And sadly, a lot of custody evaluators ascribe to this belief that it takes two to tango. It's he said, she said. Anytime a child rejects a parent, it's both parents' fault. They're the main problem, in my opinion. The custody evaluators who don't like to call alienation out when they see it. They tend to say, well, everybody's contributing. And if everybody's contributing, then why should the judge force the child to do something that the child says he or she doesn't want?
Now, a custody evaluator, just so we're clear, is that always a mental health professional?
In some states, but in some states it can be the GAL. And that term, guardian ad litem, has different meanings in different states. Sometimes it's an attorney who just is the voice of the child, and sometimes they actually do custody evaluations. I think in Connecticut, they do custody evaluations, and they don't always have to be a mental health professional.
So I think from what I'm hearing is that this is more in alignment with the mental health issue, right? I mean, than it is with a legal issue, because legally, sans abuse, really, every parent has a right to have time with their child and to help raise that child. So when you put an attorney in to do a custody evaluation with no mental health background, then wouldn't you get less of a quality evaluation?
I think that's an excellent hypothesis. I don't know that that's been tested, but I think a solution would be to even have the GALs trained in the 5-factor model. They don't even know what they're paying attention to.
Yeah.
You know, they don't know how to differentiate alienation from estrangement. So I'm not.
Look for something you don't know about, right?
Right. I think it's easier to train people to do a good job than to try to change the law so that those people aren't doing custody evaluations. But that's just my opinion.
No, I hear that. And so so for people who are in the middle of their court cases right now, and obviously the courts, because of COVID, many states, they're not working at the capacity they once were, and they're encouraging people to do collaborative divorces or mediate their divorces out instead of litigate it. What would be some recommendations that if you have, that you could give to a couple? So, someone's watching this at home at night, you're listening to this video, and you had to give them some pearls of wisdom in terms of, I don't want to say parenting, but in terms of kind of quashing or quieting down the anger or vitriol that they have toward one another. What would you suggest so that they don't end up down that road, Dr. Baker?
So I think there's a lot of that in the answer to that question, which is could be a very elaborate answer, is in my book, Co-Parenting with the Toxic Ex. And I do feel badly about the title. The publisher, wanted that to be the title. It wasn't my first choice. I don't really believe in calling other people toxic. I think that's sort of overused. And certainly if a parent were reading it and the kids saw it, it would be, oh, mommy, you think daddy's toxic? It's not going to help. I feel badly that that's the title. But there's a lot of stuff. It really walks people through first how to look at yourself and see, are you feeling jealous? Are you feeling threatened? Are you feeling this? Are you feeling that? And what to do about it. And then how to approach the other parent if you think you're contributing, and how to look at your own parenting and make sure that you're not just blaming the other parent, like, oh, my kids are mad at me, it must be alienation. Well, maybe not. Maybe, you're not listening in the way you need to, or you're not paying enough attention or time to your child. So in that book, we walk, my co-author and I walk parents through sort of a whole process. So I'm trying to sort of quickly distill a couple pearls of wisdom. I would say don't assume everything is the other parent's fault. That is for sure. I think that there's a couple classic errors that targeted parents make. And one is finding a way to interact with your child that doesn't involve being reactive and angry all the time. Why are you doing this? Why are you calling me by my first name? Why are you spying on me? Why did you keep that secret? Why are you referring to your father's girlfriend as mommy after 3, whatever, all the things that like make us so anxious when we, find out, our kid is perhaps being turned against us. When that process starts to happen, 2 common sort of problems the targeted parents face is, one is becoming depressed, demoralized, despairing, sort of not being their best, most attentive, loving parent because they're so distracted by this horror that they're experiencing, or sort of taking the bait and constantly arguing with their child. There are parenting strategies, and again, a lot of it is in that book, that teaches parents how to navigate. I think another thing to think about is, in an ideal world, parents would have the same bedtime, cell phone rules, homework rules, eating, patterns and styles, whatever. But when people are, uncoupling, it's not the law. And it's not even always bad for kids if, you have bedtime at your house is 8:30 and the other parent doesn't believe in bedtime and lets the kids stay up. If it's harming the kids, then yeah, you probably should say something behind the scenes to that parent. Hey, I have a concern. My understanding is bedtime's sort of late at your house. I'm kind of worried about it. Can we have a conversation? But a lot of times I think people get overly aggravated and frustrated that the other parent isn't following the rules, especially, let's say, a typical scenario. There are others, but you're the mom, you've been with the kids most of the time, you rule the roost, you get to make most of the rules in the home. Then there's a divorce and that other person sort of does things differently. You don't get to tell them, that the kids can't have ice cream for breakfast in the other home. And it's not undermining you if they give the kid ice cream for breakfast. So it's really trying to figure out, like, what's your domain? What do you get to have a say on? A lot of people come to me with complaints that the other parent's undermining them. And I'm not convinced that that's what it is. I think that each parent does have a right. It's called parallel parenting. And, I tell kids, look, your kid goes to school. Let's just imagine they go to school and, math teacher, is tough as nails and, no talking in the class and whatever. And the English teacher, loosey-goosey, call him by his first name. Everything is warm and fuzzy and it doesn't harm the kids. What you can say to your kid is, in mom's house, we don't eat ice cream for breakfast. In dad's house, he gets to decide. And that's it. And I think that could conceivably bring some of the tension between the two homes down, is to accept the reality that there are limits to your authority.
Yeah, I tell people, stay in your lane, like control, just do your thing and let them, as long as it's not egregious to the child, let them stay in their lane. Like, you can't control from arm's length like you'd like to, right?
Yeah, and I think a big thing has to do with cell phone use. So I had a parent tell me the other day, I took away, Sally's cell phone, and I'm so angry that the other parent went out and got her one. And, my feeling is, well, did you talk to that parent about why you were taking away her cell phone? Was that the best, response to do that? It's not necessarily, some parents feel like, hey, my kid goes to school or my kid goes here, I want them to have a cell phone. Of course, I'm going to get them another phone. The other parent doesn't get to tell me when I'm with my kid, whether they can have their phone or not. And so now that situation's a little more complicated because they actually had a contract, the two parents, about how they were going to co-parent. And if you violate that contract, that's different. In most situations, the parents don't have a contract. They don't have an agreement that they have to abide by.
Well, yeah, that would be extremely controlling for the most part. If you had a contract and then you keep looking at it as you're not listening to me, and who defines what's in that contract, and that's a hard thing to live up to, I think.
I think so too. I think that it's better to, in general, it's better to accept the reality that you are going to have less control, especially if you were the parent who really made most of the family decisions about food and extracurricular activities, etc. So the other sort of pearl of wisdom, maybe it's a pearl, is when you're negotiating your parenting plan, don't just take your attorney's word for it that this is a good plan. I have a lot of people bring their plan to me and I'm like, well, look, your kid's 10 and they don't have a cell phone yet. You might want in there who gets to buy the phone and who gets to, because the person who buys the phone controls
Absolutely
a lot of elements of the phone. You want to make sure that's negotiated now. I feel frustrated sometimes that these parenting plans have lots and lots of wiggle room, lots of areas for disagreement. You can't button it all up, but you could do a whole lot better than some of the plans that I see.
That is my biggest area. So when I've done mediations, the first thing I do is start out with the parenting plan, because if you start out with the financial pieces first, it becomes very disheartening. You get angry about that, then it gets taken out on the parenting plan. So if you're going to do what's most important to them, and you ask them what's the most important thing about your relationship, they're going to say, our children, of course. Well, then let's get that straightened out first before but I always say more is better in a parenting plan. You don't even have to live by it, but you have guidelines.
Yep.
Like more is
Yeah,
better.
so another element of parenting plans I find sort of lacking is the move away clause. I mean, it used to say, nobody can move out of state, but that's ridiculous. If you live in a large state, you could move hundreds of miles away. That's a complete, or you could move 2 miles away and be in another state. That makes no sense to me. It's really about being able to still be involved on a moment-to-moment basis in your child's life. Hey, Dad, soccer schedules it's 6, not 7. Okay, you're close enough that you can hop in the car and make that happen.
Yep.
So I don't think there's any magic number. I know people who live in New York City and they literally have it. You can't move above, 89th Street, and you can't move below, further east than this avenue, because they know that any further you're talking about a subway or a bus ride or a car ride, and it's going to change the quality of your interaction with your kids.
Well, that's smart, because you could be in California and you can say, well, you could be in LA or you could be in San Francisco. When you say, well, you can't move out of state, well, that's a huge state.
Right.
So that
makes no sense. It's really about how am I going to navigate the day to day. So, basically, the thing that I feel most strongly about is you want everybody to stay in the same school district. Because once you're out of district, you lose so much control. The schools don't really treat you the same. It's harder to get into the portal. It's harder to get to the conferences. It's harder. You're not a taxpayer in that county, it feels very different for everybody.
You're not part of the community, right? That your children are part of. So that's a really good point. That's a really good point.
Well, that's what parenting plan should say. Nobody can move out of the school district. And take the kids. You can look, if you want to move, you can move wherever, but you can't take the kids or expect the other parent to accommodate you.
Right. And so when people remarry, because I see this very often, people remarry and then their partner is going to take a job in a different state. So they don't understand why it's difficult. They can't just up and go. And I'm like, because the father is here. So it's probably best that parent maybe not take that job, instead of just moving the kids and thinking it's no big deal for a parent, or vice versa, for a parent who really wants to be invested. You know, so not easy stuff. And so the two organizations again that you would refer to for reunification would be.
I wouldn't call them organizations.
Okay.
They're just programs. So one is Turning Points for Families, and then the other is Family Bridges.
Okay.
They both have data. They've been around a long time. They have high success rates. They've codified what they do. There's manuals. It's accessible, not necessarily to the lay public, but I know that I have confidence, and I've talked to families that have gone through those programs and feel that it's been a very positive experience. So those are the two programs that I refer to. And
lastly, Dr. Baker, would you say that if you're the older your child gets, the more difficult it is to reunify with?
The older the child, the harder it is to get the courts to mandate reunification therapy. It's not impossible. I know 16 and 17-year-olds who are sent to those programs, but in general, especially if the favored parent can drag things out in court, then it's like, oh, the kid's turning 18 in 6 months, let's just let it go. But I want to be clear that even if your child's 18 or 28 or 38 or 48, of course, the courts can't do anything, but there are ways. First of all, it happens spontaneously. Some of these kids figure it out. That's the topic of my first book, Adult Children of Parental Alienation, Breaking the Ties That Bind. But also I have a lot of clients whose kids are over 18. The courts aren't going to do anything. And I've helped them, not all, but some of them, reunite with their child.
So there is hope. There is hope.
Absolutely. And if anybody, wants to be inspired, they could read Adult Children of Parental Alienation. I think the word syndrome is in the title, Breaking the Ties That Bind, because it tells the story of 40 adults who lived through it and had the realization that, gee, maybe I ditched this parent and I shouldn't have. Maybe there's a relationship here that I really need to reestablish. And they reconnected with that parent.
Well, I'm going to leave it on that note then, because that's a positive note. And for a difficult and challenging situation for many people, I think there's good to see that there's potential hope. Even if you don't get it through the court system, you may get it afterward. Right?
Absolutely. It depends on what you do. I mean, some of these kids come around on their own. I identified 12 different catalysts to them having the realization. So there's a lot that can happen just as they travel their lives and mature. And there are things that the targeted parent can do. And that's really what I do in my coaching.
Well, I'm going to put all your details in the YouTube, so people in the YouTube detail section, so people can get your books. I'll list your books. I'll list your contact information, and people can reach out to you with questions or for coaching and helping get guidance and heading in the right direction. So thank you so much for taking your time today. I know you're busy, and I think it's been really informative. You've given a lot of good information, I think, and kind of clarified things for people. So thank you. Thank you, Dr. Baker.
My pleasure. Take care.
Bye-bye.